Can everybody? Okay, can everybody hear me?
Can we start to just come in and settle down? Just another 2 minutes, please, so we can allow the ones at the back to make their way inside. I don't know, are you guys scared of the front row seats? What's happening here? Can't we move a bit forward, please, man? Professor Kiet, I don't know why you're sitting so far at the back. Big people like you come sit here in front. Also, all you students, you can mingle with the big people. You don't have to all sit together. Can't we lower this thing? Can I rather hold the mic? I just feel like it's in my face. Can it drop any further, please, ma'am? Yeah, that's much better. Yo. Yeah. You're going to have to come lift it for the taller people. How's it looking there at the back burner? Can we start to go live? 1 minute. Okay, everybody, can you start settling down? We want to go live. Ladies and gentlemen, can we settle down, please? Okay. Okay, are we ready? All right, good evening, everybody. Good evening to all those in attendance this evening. Okay, we are currently also live on Herald Live's Facebook page, so I'd like for us to just get started. To those of you here in the community hall and to those of you watching live, good evening and welcome to yet another community dialogue that's hosted by the Herald and Nelson Mandela University. Ours is a long-standing partnership that provides a platform for rousing debate around important topical issues affecting our communities at large. Tonight will be no different. We bring you yet another dialogue with a lineup of accomplished speakers who will be debating the topic, the national question reloaded. Now that in itself is a loaded statement. Why is the concept of non-racialism of little use in ongoing struggle for an anti-racist and just South Africa? So what exactly is non-racialism? I mean, I try to find an exact definition. And I mean, it's something that we hear every day. It's this term abound in SA, in the ideologies and ideals of political parties. But what does it mean? It's been described as ideology rejecting racism, but some argue that it denies the concept of racism altogether, and with it, the lived experiences and history of racial inequality. But I'm not here to put forward a debate. I'm just here to facilitate, and we have a lineup of speakers who will have plenty to say, no doubt. And I hope you two as the audiences. Okay, first up, we have Eusebius Makaza, who will introduce a skeptical argument against non-racialism, explaining why he considers the concept to be of little use in ongoing struggles for an anti-racist and just South Africa. But I'm just going to quickly read Eusebius's credentials. Ooh, okay. Eusebius is a political analyst, author, broadcaster, public speaker, and podcaster. His main home currently is as an analyst and contributor to Times Live. He's also the host of the popular podcast In the Ring with Eusebius Makaza. Eusebius has published 3 local best-selling books. I saw someone actually brought the books here this evening. That was really cool. He's going to do some book signing afterwards if anyone else has brought books, eh? His books are Bantu in My Bathroom, Could I Vote DA, and Run, Racist, Run. He has written extensively in the local media and also globally, previously carrying a column in the New York Times, while a regular on shows like Amanpur on CNN and on BBC World Service. He has presented news and current affairs shows and radio talk shows on SABC, ENCA, 702, Power 987. Shoo. He is a debate and public speaking coach, having previously won the World Masters Debate Championship. He has studied law and philosophy at Rhodes and done research on whether or not racists are morally responsible for their beliefs at Oxford. He has also taught philosophy in South Africa and the UK, and he's also an Eastern Cape guy. So please, everybody, just welcome Eusebius up onto the stage. Can I have a seat here? Oh, sit here. You can sit here closest to me because you'll be the first one speaking. And then I'm also going to invite some of the respondents. Eusebius will be introducing the topic as the main speaker, and then there'll be respondents who will be responding to the message that he puts forward. We've got Christian Martin. He doesn't really need an introduction, does he? Huh? Khoi and San activist. He's a member of the Eastern Cape Geographical Name Change Committee. That's why you get these things right. Huh? That's why. And he's a South African Human Rights Commission monitor. Please give it up for Christian Martin. Okay, and then lastly, we've got Professor Nomalanga Mkhize. Nomalanga is a historian based at the Nelson Mandela University. Okay, she has a master's from Rhodes University and a PhD from UCT. She has a wide range of teaching and research interests. Currently, her interest is in isiXhosa historical texts from 1800s and 1900s. She studies these texts in helping to build up African perspectives of South African history, an area which is largely underdeveloped in the academy. Okay, these are our speakers tonight, and so will you. So we'll have a question and answer session and also an opportunity for you to put perhaps forward a different view. But let me not waste any time. Eusebius, can you please come up here to introduce the topic?
Thanks, Rochelle. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. I love the fact that this event is not taking place in Summerstrand, and that is also symbolically important to what we're going to be talking about, which is how to get rid of racism and its legacy. And so maybe a good place to start is also to affirm precisely our own excellence. Rochelle has been very nice. She herself is an absolutely brilliant colleague of mine, an excellent journalist, an alumnus of the university, and I want to thank the university and the Herald for hosting me this week and for the community dialogues. And she's also a brilliant editor of your local newspaper. Can we please also put our hands together and thank her for being here? It's particularly nice to see so many young people, and I hope that you will engage and not be shy to ask questions. So let me get straight into it. I first want to explain why the topic is important. I felt a little bit guilty, but only a few minutes, and then I realized that I need to explain why to myself and to you the topic is important. Now, in some ways, I'm preaching to the converted. I suspect most of you are here because you know the topic is important, unless you were forced to come here. And so, you know, in that sense, you probably care about conversations around non-racialism. But I think for the sake of completeness, I want to just share why I felt a bit guilty and why it is irrational to feel guilty about the topic. I felt a bit guilty because I thought to myself, especially being in the northern areas, driving here, past Katanga, that the most obvious things that we need to address as a community is to ask, what are we going to do about unemployment, about gang violence? What are we going to do about income inequality, asset inequality, wealth inequality? The lives and the quality of lives are chalk and cheese differences between being in the northern areas and being at the beach hotel where I'm staying in Summerstrand. And those are deep, deep, deep questions. What are we going to do to this mental apartheid spatial geography that still lives on in Nelson Mandela Metropolitan as a municipal area? So those are all questions that cry out for community engagement. And here we are talking about non-racialism. But of course, it is maybe on the face of it a reason to think that this is not as important as talking about crime, energy insecurity, etc. But that is precisely why we should be talking about racism, because there are connections between the original sin on which this country is built, which is white supremacy, and a lot of what we are experiencing in terms of inequality and the different kinds of violence in our communities. It is not to say that the only explanation for why life continues to be miserable for millions of black people in South Africa is because of our history. I mean, after all, we've got a black-led government after 1994 that has also been anti-black and anti-poor in many of its policies and many of its actions as a government. So democracy hasn't exactly been kind to black people in South Africa. So our problems are not only historic, but they are also historic. And so if you want to truly, completely, deeply understand questions of poverty, inequality, low growth, the strikes that are going on at the university within different sectors of our economy, the working poor fighting for a meaningful wage level and real rises in income, not nominal rises that are below inflation and in real terms means that what you can buy with your money this month is less than what you could buy last month. You have to tackle the question of racism. And so I checked myself for feeling bad that we are framing a conversation about race, because racism is a very real part of the overall set of causes that explain why life in South Africa is still miserable for so many black people. So that's by way of saying the topic is really important. Now, when we want to deal with racism, there are so many parts of that problem that we need to disentangle. We can't do it all in one community dialogue. So in a sense, we have sliced off one part of the conversation, quite nerdishly, but I think it is an important one, and it's an important one for many different constituencies in the country. There are older generations in the room than myself, I was a lightie in back then Grahamstown, growing up in the 80s. But many black people galvanized in the fight against apartheid in the 80s in the final push under broad mass democratic movement banners that believed in the concept of non-racialism as an organizing concept around which to fight for a just and anti-racist South Africa. And now we can fast forward to 2023 and ask ourselves many questions about racism. But the one that we're asking tonight, just because we can have a focused discussion, is whether the idea of non-racialism is the right vision for what kind of South Africa we want to live in. And can we organize activism around the idea of non-racialism? And for me, the answer is no, we can't. And I wish that I wasn't the first speaker, because in a sense, you ideally want someone who drinks the Kool-Aid to tell you why non-racialism still has life in it. But as someone who is nerdish, I want to do my best to try and explain why you might be tempted to still hold on to non-racialism. And I know that there are people in the audience, I'm subtweeting them, who do think that non-racialism still has life in it, and they can ask questions and make the case during the Q&A. But I think, in essence, and I'll spend a minute or two on this, the idea behind non-racialism, which Rochelle started to sketch, is something that more or less is the following. And to the extent that my summary of it is unfair, those who want to defend non-racialism can do so in our engagement. But in essence, non-racialism is the idea, step one, that recognizes that races do not exist scientifically. Race is a myth. It is an invention. It was made up politically as a basis for oppressing people on the basis of characteristics that are observable, such as your skin color and your hair texture. And then we started having groups designated on the basis of these very superficial characteristics, and we started othering one another based on those group identities that were politically and socially constructed. And if we take a slice of South African history, but there's a global version of this, by the time we get from the beginnings of the settlers arriving here to fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, the National Party, of course, tried to codify in law and in policies in incredible detail anti-black racist ideologies, which is what Rochelle was referring to, in the way in which it tried to choreograph life in South Africa, particularly from 1948 onwards. But the basis of apartheid was an unscientific basis. The divide and rule happened on the basis of the construction of race, and it was an unscientific project, but it served a political purpose. And that was, of course, to sustain white supremacy and to make sure that black people are in fact oppressed. And so it's kind of interesting that you have something that doesn't exist in biology but can be the basis of very real suffering, trauma, intergenerational trauma, and oppression, and a whole political project that flows out of an entirely biological bit of nonsense. Race is biological nonsense. So then the question becomes, if you are committed to fighting oppression, how do you sketch the end game and the end goal? How do you think about what is it that you want to achieve? Imagine, and for some of you in the audience, you don't have to imagine it because you lived it. Those of us who are younger only have vague memories, and those who are younger than me don't have direct experience in their blood. But imagine or recall, if you were there, thinking through in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what it is that you are fighting for in your activism. And we know, of course, that across the class, racialized, geographical, linguistic, and cultural differences, the fight against the Nats in the 80s was organized in a powerful way around the concept of non-racialism. And that raises the question for especially younger people and people of my age, what did our foreparents who ended up negotiating a settlement have in mind when they thought that non-racialism is a good organizing principle? And I think what they had in mind is to hold on to the truth that race should not be fetishized, because race doesn't exist and it's a political construct, and that non-racialism as a term and as a concept is a good organizing concept, because you start off recognizing that racism is complete BS, and then from there the next step is to rob it of its power so that you can almost, as Crane Sodin puts it in his reading of Neville Alexander, end up in what some academics might call a post-human understanding of our place in the world as individual South Africans and as groups. So the non-racialism that was conceived of by many of the activists in the 80s is not a form of color blindness, but it's rather a deep appeal to recognizing the social reality that even though race is a biological construction, it can be used to oppress us as black people. But then to go and do the hard work to undo that oppressive consequences of how the Nats had used the biological nonsense to create apartheid. But the vision was a vision in which the humanity of every single person is fully recognized, restored, and there's an equality in our right to dignity, which then becomes, to fast forward the story, the founding values of our Constitution. That's about as much as I will do by way of being kind to my opponents. Those who want to defend themselves can do so in the discussion. I want to turn to what my view is as Eusebius. And my generation, I'm in my early 40s now, is sort of not quite the fallists, but not the South African generation that is romantic about the 80s and that organizing principle. So, and I think this is where I was suggesting, Nomalanga, we might have something in common. I don't quite have the cynicism that I think sometimes creeps into the fallists project, but I do have a skepticism that I think some older black South Africans do not have about non-racialism. And I want to explain it, and then I'll sit down and you can hear from the respondents, and then it will be your turn. The problem with non-racialism is actually very simple. And it's not an intellectual problem, it's a practical problem. That it has been appropriated by everyone. So everyone knows that non-racialism has got good stuff associated with it as a word. It's a bit like Ubuntu. Every second street, there's a business that has the word Ubuntu in it, because everyone associates Ubuntu with good vibes. So if the word Ubuntu gets misappropriated, next thing you're going to have someone from the Freedom Front Plus having a business that has the name Ubuntu in it. And you know that the bugger isn't committed to Ubuntu, but he's cashing in on the word. So the problem is that in practical terms, you have to watch what happens to a concept and what happens even to a word, not just a concept. And sometimes, it's unfair historically, but sometimes the reality is that a word becomes disempowered because it has traveled too far and too wide. And that is exactly what has happened to non-racialism in this bloody country. Helen Zille thinks she's committed to non-racialism. John Steenhuisen thinks he's committed to non-racialism. Peter Groenewald thinks he's committed to non-racialism. ANC leaders say they're committed to non-racialism. Everyone is committed to non-racialism. And you think to yourself, your politics are incompatible. You can't all be talking about the same thing. And that is your first sign that the term has become so elastic that it no longer has any meaning. So my real beef with the concept is actually a really basic beef, that it has just been pulled in all sorts of directions by everyone who knows to be associated with the idea of non-racialism is a pretty cool thing. And so it leaves the question, where's the radicalism that's left in this idea as it was conceived of by those who rallied around the concept in the 80s and the folks who still have symposia based on the thought of Neville Alexander? And I'm not subtweeting you, Alan. Because the question then becomes, what are you doing to recover what it was that you imagined you were aiming for when you said, let's try and create a non-racial South Africa? So of course, there are at least two ways you can respond to this, and I don't want to be too complicated and give you a lecture on this, but I want to keep my analysis crisp, but also quite blunt. You can spend some time in the academy, academically, on the pages of the EP Herald. I don't know if there's talk radio in Algoa, or wherever you have discussions around the braai, you can try and fight back against the charlatans who abuse it. Many people who call themselves non-racial are racists. Many people who say they are committed to non-racialism in South Africa are colorblind. The DA does not want race-based affirmative action. John Steenhuisen doesn't want us to talk about racialized experiences in South Africa. He doesn't want us to talk about what Rochelle was referring to, the lived experience of black people that actually references how race comes into it even as a social construct, because it makes them uncomfortable. They're scared that around the corner of talking about race, we're going to have to talk about redistribution and about justice and about reparations. And those charlatans, I want to unmask them. So I don't want to spend 10 years of labor while the economy is crap, while people get paid poorly at provincial, while students are fighting for access to university. I don't have enough time to fight for this concept. So what is a better way to try and organize for a just and anti-racist South Africa? And I say the answer is simple. Let's rather substitute the preamble of the Constitution that refers to a non-racial vision with the term anti-racism. And it's more than just a word fight. It is an important, strategic activism fight. Because I can tell you now for sure, you go ask John Steenhuisen and any Karen in the suburbs, do you believe in non-racialism, ma'am? The answer will be yes, of course. It's very important. What she has in mind by that is, please don't refer to the past. But if you ask a different question, should we run a manifesto for 2024 as the DA on the basis of an anti-racist project, you're going to have deep differences between provincial leaders, between the different leaderships of the party. And I'm using them just as an easy example, but it's not only a politics conversation, it's also a conversation between us outside of formal politics. And the nice thing about anti-racism is that it does two things that is unambiguous that you don't find in the term non-racialism and how that concept has traveled over the last 30 years. Anti means you have to take an active stance against something. Non is a pretty neutral term grammatically, but also politically, as far as I'm concerned. And racism, unlike racialism, tells you that you acknowledge the existence of racism. Racialism is a weaker concept than racism. All racialism means is, from a description point of view, certain characteristics like skin color, hair texture, exists sort of in terms of how we view each other. And so it's easier for someone to say, yeah, no, cool, dude, I want to live in a country where, like, you know, we don't take too much notice of your skin color. But if I ask you, do you want to join me in an activism that is aimed at eliminating racism? It's a more awkward question. It's a sharper question because it forces you, if you say yes, to concede that racism still exists in society. And so, to put it differently, only a small group of people who call themselves non-racial activists, or activists for non-racialism rather, would also be willing to sign up for a project that fights against white supremacy and for an anti-racist South Africa. And so if we frame what kind of society it is that we want to build, a just and anti-racist South Africa, we can weed out the ones who are insincere, who are opportunistic, and who are abusing the idea of non-racialism. And it really is just a fancy way of saying, can we please stop talking about race and color? The most they will be prepared to do, and even this they are insincere about, is to say that the true struggle for justice in South Africa is about class warfare. We need to make sure people, you even hear politicians in the DA, and they just give me easy fodder for the general case, I'm afraid, will say things like, I don't know why that Eusebius guys goes on about race. The most important thing for black people is that they want a job. So they pretend they actually care about questions of the economy, but of course they don't really, because racism is also deeply embedded in capitalism, And the racialized nature of capitalism and the capitalist project is something they don't confront. If you have a Marxist analysis of just how bad the political economy is in South Africa, they're going to run for the hills because racism doesn't leave you behind once you have a job at a factory in Port Elizabeth. Racism is going to affect whether or not the security follows you around when you are at Green Acres, assuming you're a thief until you speak in coconut English, and then they relax a little bit. Racism is going to stop you from career progression even if you have a job. Racism means that Dr. Mpho Latse, not that she is a politician, never had a chance at any rate within the DA because she's not part of the network of the Old Boys Club. So there's this myth that if we only focus on rands and cents and economic discussion, then the country can be fixed. And what I say is bullshit. Racism is so ever present that you shouldn't be fooled by people who don't want to talk about racism, who say another good reason not to have that discussion that Eusebius convinced them to have in Bettelsdorp is that he focuses on the wrong things. We need to talk about getting South Africans working. If a politician says that next year, don't vote for them. Because the number of things we have to solve for, we can't choose between. We've got deep political, economic challenges in the country. But they are intertwined with the fight against racism. And so I want to end by just making the following remarks. How deep is the choice between saying we're fighting for non-racialism versus anti-racism? What I want to say to those who are romantic about the unity movement is, which of the things, I was pausing there, I wanted to speak Afrikaans, but I think we've got a more, not quite as homogenous a crowd as I am assuming. The things that you liked about non-racialism in the 80s that you're romantic about, which bits there? Where's Andre? What will you lose if you come to my side? You lose nothing, but you gain something. You gain something because you weed out John Steenhuisen and his friends. But you don't lose the things you were fighting for. So there's nothing in the analysis about racism being biological nonsense that you lose. I agree with that as someone who advocates for anti-racism as the right vision for our country. But what I gain on my side, that I think all the black South Africans must get rid of with that romance about the 80s, is that anti-racism is so much more powerful, which is why so many young activists on campuses rally around it alternatively, is that you retain the basic analysis that's kick-started non-racialism, but with one difference, and it's an important, decisive upside, that if I ask you whether you're on board in fighting against white supremacy and fighting for an anti-racist society, and you have an awkward pause, that I know whether you're with me or whether you're against me. But if we continue to bang on about non-racialism, we will never really know who is serious about marching towards a just South Africa. Thank you.
Sure. I think that's given us a lot of food for thought, eh? I think Eusebius has basically challenged everyone. Yeah. Can you say that you are serious about rooting out white supremacy and racism in South Africa if you still ascribe to the term non-racialism? He makes the argument that you cannot. And I don't know, let's see what Christian Martin has to say. I suspect he's got similar views, but let me call him up here to the podium.
Thank you very much to the editor of the Herald. Yes, Eusebius, you see, I'm from the 80s, so I put on my glasses. Now, I just wanted to say, Program Director, let me acknowledge a few people at least. And a person that I actually must acknowledge, Eusebius, is my former principal, Mr. Jordan, that is here. What I know about politics, whether it's dangerous or not, you have to blame him for that. Because again, in this 80s, that UCBS have harped upon, that was the time that we have done our activism. This was the hall, the stage, where we have screamed our mandlas and the vivas, the Koopmans are here. They would be aware of that. And then the other people I also want to just honor is Mr. Stack Mitchell, also one of our old activists, and people like myself used to learn politics from individuals like himself. And then the councillors, Mr. Lawrence Struan, I've seen the speaker, Mr. Cheslin Felix, also present here tonight. I just want to say thank you. And then also from the Koyan Sun leadership, PC Steenkamp, with his entourage, as well as PC Human, that are with us here today. Program Director, UCBS, Dr. Mkhize, ladies and gentlemen. When I started to prepare for this session, there was such a lot of information available. And then you have to look, as UCBS have said, your audience and what they expect from you. And then I start with Marxism and the national question. And then I went over to the national question and the other things that you can also talk about, the pillars of racism. And then I said, let me just prepare for the people that I live amongst every day. Ladies and gentlemen, most slogans in the early 80s and even just before 1994 elections focus on uniting all South Africans under the banner of South Africa belong to all who live in it. I fondly remember slogans like UDF, Unite, Apartheid Divide, Amandla Ethu, meaning power to the people. My personal favorite, taught by our then teachers, Amain Williams, Dorian Baichis, and my mentor, Ashley Le Pen, was an injury to one is an injury to all. Songs I can still remember singing was that, what have we done? What have we done? The only sin is the color of my skin. Looking back today at our dark past, I ask myself, what slogans can we shout now? Can I still respond to Amandla and saying Gawetu? Or won't it be more fitting to respond with Api Abantu Uteta Ngapo? Freely translated, which people are you talking about? If someone shouted then, UDF Unite, Apartheid Divide, should it not be today, Apartheid united us, but today we are divided, an injury to one will become an injury to some. At least some will agree that our favorite song, What Have We Done? What Have We Done? The only sin is the color of my skin would be as relevant and appropriate today as it was then during the dark apartheid days. South Africans in general and government in particular should take responsibility to create a non-racial society and make sure that non-racialism and the national question are not debated and theorized topics by politicians and academics when we're nearing elections, but actual concepts implemented and lived by. There are no shortage of information on the two concepts, non-racialism and the national question in South Africa. Our Tambo unpacked multiracialism versus non-racialism and why the ANC chose non-racialism. Neville Alexander also unpacked non-racialism and the national question in the South African context. In 2020, before the 2021 elections, the regional ANC RTT under the leadership of Comrade Nebafaku and Comrade Nakula through Comrade Ronald Lamola also gave a lecture on the national question. That's why I can say that we have no shortage of understanding the concept of the national question, though I have a problem understanding what does it mean to say the national question reloaded. Because to reload something means it has been used before, but as we all know, used in theory, but in practice, no. The UDF of 1983 gave us South Africans a glimpse of what a non-racial society should look like and how the national question should be addressed. Former late President Nelson Mandela's cabinet has built on the idea of the UDF through his government of national unity, which reflected non-racialism and addressed the national question. Former President Thabo Mbeki, through his I'm an African speech, have captured our non-racial dream well and showed out how interdependent we are, even though our being to each other. Even former President Jacob Zuma cabinet also reflected non-racialism and addressed the national question the best way he could. The question we should or must ask is, when and where did it go wrong? When did addressing non-racialism and the national question became important but not a priority? When did what ordinary South Africans once were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice became something only to write about, debate, and make speeches of? When was this ideal a dream of a non-racial society and a national question deferred? The direct result of addressing non-racialism and the national question we experienced through the frustration of the new political parties which were openly racially biased, like for instance the DP to become the DA, ID, Minority Front, GOOD, Cape Coloured Congress, Freedom Front, Patriotic Alliance, Northern Alliance, Compatriots of South Africa, National Coloured Party, and the new kid on the block is, as we know, our President Samuel Davids is here. These aforesaid parties were started because of a feeling of being left behind, marginalized or forgotten. As South Africans, we should truly discuss these concepts as to make it a reality in our time and not leave for future generations. Eusebius, I still believe we can, if there's enough activism behind this, if we don't vie for positions in the parties we belong and try to appease and have nice speeches when you should actually speak the truth to fact, then we stand back and we don't say what we're supposed to say. I truly believe we can still strive to create South Africa in a non-racialism and still address the national question. I thank you.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank Christian for doing all the protocols. I'm a journalist. We are not good at protocols. I'm sorry. So, yeah, all protocol observed. Thank you for that. Look, I thought I knew what you were going to talk about, but I was wrong. But one thing that did, strike me from what Christian spoke about is the fact that particularly here in Nelson Mandela Bay, we've seen so many parties that have been formed because, there's communities that feel marginalized. He referred to Samuel, who is here. The Northern Alliance was formed for that very reason. And I think that is something that we need to talk about. There are communities that are being marginalized, and that's something that's not being discussed openly enough. So yeah, that was definitely an interesting take for me. I would like to now bring up Prof. Kize, if you can come up and give your thoughts.
I feel like I am supposed to have home ground advantage or something. So I'm like, I must debate Eusebius. But unfortunately, we agree. So, yeah. No, what I think, thank you to both. It was nice to have that historical lived experience versus the critique. And I thought, let me actually start by actually defending non-racialism. Yeah, me, I will defend it. I will defend it right here. And I will, but I will start by defending it, and then I will probably then betray them and move more towards Eusebius's position. And I was thinking about a meme that I saw somewhere on social media during this time of load shedding as it was getting bad. And this young person sends out a tweet saying, yeah, we want round 2 against apartheid. Our parents, they failed. You know, basically we, the young people, if we just had a chance, we could probably take this apartheid thing down, you know. And then somebody replied to the tweet and said, you can't even organize against load shedding. So you don't even think about it. And really, Uncle Christian there, that is the point, that there is a historical reality that non-racialism was developed, emerged, and was talking and speaking and fighting under, that nobody of my generation and those coming after can imagine if you did not live through it. And that to be in South Africa that was so incredibly authoritarian and fascist, and its entire premise was in fact that apartheid divides, and the young people and the people of the time get up and say, we will speak the complete opposite gospel of that, and that will be the gospel of non-racialism or the politics of non-racialism. That is a radical position to take under a regime that seeks to do the opposite. So in that sense, Eusebius, I don't think that we can even begin to imagine what it is like to have to talk to a government that literally walks onto your streets and shoots your children and drives off, that shoots 13-year-olds, to get up and say to that government, we will not let you divide us. We will not even let you divide us against the same white people you say you are defending. That is a radical position. And I think that was the spirit in which people advanced and thought about non-racialism in its time. So it's quite, arrogant of those of us who are born after that time to be able to say, well, you know what, we're going to come and critique your ideas when you never face guns and you never face bullets and you don't know what it's like to walk out onto the street and not know if you're going to be taken, thrown into a jail, disappear, thrown off the building, burnt up and thrown into what you call the septic tank there by Craddock. When I drove past Post Chalmers in Craddock, and it's still there, and I thought about those members of the PEBCO 3 whose remains were found there. There are many young people that never came back to this country. All they were doing was fighting for a South Africa in which, if they wanted to, they could go over to the other side and say, I'm a human like you, you're a friend like me, against one of the most brutal, nuclear-empowered regimes on the planet. Non-racialism in that context is highly radical and highly humanistic and highly ethical, and a very strong position to take in an utterly morally bankrupt system. That was the defense. So now, with that in mind, I want to come to bridge now with Eusebius's critique that the trouble now is that that concept does not seem to drive or deliver in today's current state, that it does not seem to be able to help us to deal with the way in which the privileges and power that has carried over for white South Africans still shapes this country to this very day, right? Now, that, I think, is a question that we need to get really into. But it's not just about non-racialism. We must ask that about Black consciousness itself. I think a political philosophy that I'm more socialized in. Why is it that Black consciousness does not seem to rally political parties? And this is a question that some of my colleagues are asking in their own research in the university. There is something about the radical ideas of the 70s and 80s so powerful that collapses in our current era. And we have to ourselves ask ourselves why. And so the young people of today then say, yes, we see that, but we find that we have to repurpose that language, and as Eusebius argues, take it one step further and confront and develop a new kind of sharpness to it. It's become a blunt tool for the kinds of things that we have to do today. One of the things that is important for me about Eusebius's position on anti-racism is that it forces us to actually confront white privilege, white power in our institutions very sharply and very directly. It does not allow you to take a step back. It also forces Black people, colored people, Indian people, normally I would just say black, but I don't know where people stand here on those ideas. Anyway, fine, okay, all those black people combined are forced to ask themselves the question of the elephant in the room there at Nelson Mandela. When I arrived, one of the first things I said was, this whole institution needs a TRC because this was a Brewer-Bond institution. I'm concerned about the fact that this used to be the height of a lot of white power in Port Elizabeth. And we have not had that TRC. And when that TRC comes, I'm sorry, the black people, the colored people, and the Indians are going to be on this side. And the white people are going to be alone on the other side. And we cannot feel sorry for them. They must answer and they must think about where they stand. So that, I think, is what Eusebius is arguing. Then just quickly to now deal then with the next step, which is, are you going to now be sort of a Johann Steenhuisen or like a Helen Ziller? You've made this concept so elastic, a very strong critique, I think, in the sense that, is there a sense that in today's era, non-racialism is a way for our parents who've now ascended and discovered, yeah, I like the Bond there by Summerstrand. I don't actually mind living next to these white people. I don't want to always offend them. That non-racialism was transformed into a way of kind of begging for white people not to be threatened by you. So this is the question. And in another sense, I could also ask, and this may be a little bit more controversial, from a political movement custodianship point of view, is there a way in which non-racialism is an evasion of the question of becoming Africanized? And by the way, that's why everyone knows I like the evolution of us accepting Khoisan traditional leadership and realities. Because the question is about, are you choosing non-racialism so that we don't easily categorize you as an African? So with that in mind, I just want to turn, as I get to the end, I want to turn the lens back at us, however, Eusebius, as I get to the end and say, what I think is happening here, though, is what has happened in every African country after liberation. And that is that concepts of liberation fall short, but new ideas of emancipation are not fully formed. And that gap is the gap of intellectual coherence that bothers many Africans. What are the new ideas for our time? And I would argue that, in fact, non-racialism is actually in many ways more ethically superior to anti-racism, because non-racialism is saying you've got to get to a point where everyone is human. You've got to get to the point where race doesn't mean anything. Anti-racism, of course, as I've argued, forces us to face the reality in ways that we don't have to worry about white tears. And so that gap between our old ideas and the new ideas struggling to form, that is the zone where we lie. And I think the ultimate question, I think you may have posed it as well, Uncle Christian, is why is it that Africans fail to fulfill the aspirations of their own struggles after they have found freedom?
Okay, that was a good one. Prof, thank you for that. She starts off by defending non-racialism and then saying that it's arrogant of us to say now that, bring up all these concepts that, non-racialism was betrayal and so on, because we weren't there. Fair point. And then she says, no, it does nothing for us today. There are the real challenges that we are facing in South Africa today, and non-racialism sort of glosses over those. And then there was a pertinent question, are you choosing non-racialism because we don't want to be classified as African? I'm hoping that someone in the audience would be able to answer that for us today. But before we get there, I'd just like to, we're now going to move on to the question and answer session. Let me see, we're good for time. There'll also be questions that'll be coming in and comments from the online platform. We've got audiences that are watching online. I do want to just say, when you're given an opportunity to ask a question, let's keep it brief, to the point. If you're making a comment, brief, to the point, and so that we can get more responses and perhaps another round of questions.